Hello and welcome to the Inside Ellen Road podcast. I'm your host, Joe Donoghue, and as always, I'm joined by the ray of sunshine that is YUP chief football writer Graham Smith. Leeds United have confirmed their second signing of the summer this week. Slovenian international defender Jaka has arrived for an initial fee worth around £15 million. He's big, he's got a jawline you could cut a Wetherspoon steak with, and most importantly to Graham, he shut out England when Slovenia kept a clean sheet against the Three Lions at last summer's Euros. How goes it today, G-Dog?
Yeah, good. Thanks. Just thinking about taking Jaka to Wetherspoons so that he can experience some real key parts of British culture, like a steak for one, or a pitcher of rum cocktail for less than a tenner. I mean, does he know that such things exist? I mean, maybe that was part of the pitch. We know that their Leeds are going big on the whole parade and showing, players that this is a major club in a major city, and the passion here is unlike anything you might experience at a lot of other clubs. Have they considered also talking about Wetherspoons and the kind of things that are available there?
Yeah, I mean, I've been in the Beckett's Bank many a time, some against my will. But what I can say is that, they do a cracking picture. There's what's the one? There's the one which is just up on Otley Road all the way up to Headingley, the newer one. I feel like there's the Cuthbert Broderick as well. So you've got your choices there. And despite that, I've slagged them in the first the first 30 seconds of the podcast. I think we've given them some free advertising there. So I think we're entitled to a little bit of a kickback. Longest medical ever, wasn't it, Graham? Took his time, but most importantly, he is here. And yeah, it's a real statement of intent.
The reason it took so long is because he's so big that by the time they finished the medical, they had to start all over again, just like the Humber Bridge. The medical was last Wednesday. Now, I think fans were expecting this to be a lot quicker because when somebody kind of suggests on a Tuesday that the deal is done, then why wouldn't you expect, this to happen in the next 24 hours? But Leeds were always talking. Last Tuesday, I think we reported that Leeds were hopeful of getting a deal concluded in the coming days. They were saying over the next week at that stage on Tuesday. That's because it was a more complicated deal to do than I think others will be this summer. They had, obviously you're dealing with a player and you're dealing with his agent. You're also dealing with a club, and this club was Udinese. And so they had to deal with them. And he had the medical on Wednesday, and then the deal still wasn't finalised and finished, and the paperwork wasn't done. And on Friday, there was one document remaining to sign, and Leeds were hopeful that would be signed over the weekend. It wasn't. It was signed on Monday, and then everything was finally done. As well as clubs, you're dealing with leagues, and Leeds are dealing with the Premier League, and things need to be signed off and ratified. So a little bit frustrating, I think, from Leeds' point of view that it took so long. But I think the important thing was get him in the building, get his name on a piece of paper, and then let the rest of the paperwork take care of itself, and we can actually announce this guy. And a bit of a statement, I think, but also the key thing that I like in every aspect of life is when something is bargainous. And this feels, famous last words, maybe it's Erasmus Christensen Mark II, but this feels to me like a good price for the player.
It is a little bit lower than I think a lot of people would have expected. I think, given the experience that he has internationally and at club level, he's played in a top 5 European league for the past 3 seasons. He's captained Udinese, who, yes, the season before last, they escaped relegation right at the last, but typically they are a top flight club, and they do sit around mid table most of the time. So when you compare, I don't know, like a Fulham or a Brentford, and I know that the Premier League is a higher standard than Serie A. If you were going to go and get their captain, if you were going to go and get their starting centre back, who is as physically striking as he is terrifying, you're looking at maybe 35 plus million, aren't you? So yeah, there are caveats. He will have for all the stuff that we're singing his praises about, there will be elements to his game which are not at the same level as those mid-table Premier League centre backs. But I think what you can say is that they've added depth. They've certainly added character and personality. Someone who does not appear to be a shrinking violet in any capacity. Speaks 5 languages, which is going to help in any modern day football dressing room. And yeah, I just can't wait until you get the opportunity to get up to the training ground and interview him, because it'll be a redo of the time when you were on the BT Sport panel and you stood next to Peter Crouch, and we managed to capture and savor. I mean, I don't know if the rest of you savored it, but I savored it. The image of you stood next to Peter Crouch, which is just, I love that. Just being able to take the piss a little bit every now and then, not too occasionally. I respect the chain of command, but every now and then, especially if there's a visual representation of it, spot on.
Thanks for that. I'll tell you what else I like about this deal: a 5-year contract. Now, not because that means anything in football terms, because a player can sign a 5-year contract and then he can be sold within 6 months, but it means that the fee is spread out over 5 years. It means that for PSR over the next year, Leeds are looking at 3 million for the fee, and then of course his wages on top. But that is a very small amount to deal with for what is quite a key signing. And also, if you happen to sell an Ilan Melier, then you've covered Jaka for the next year, PSR wise, and his wages. Assuming Leeds United can get 5 million or more for Ilan Melier, which I think is achievable. But it just shows why these long deals are seen as quite a good idea when it comes to the headroom that you need in order to spend. But also, I quite like that they've got 2 in the door already. I know that Nemec is more of a squad signing. Beale's been signed. We can assume as a starter. He's coming here to play. But they've got 2 in, and we're not even in July. And yes, there will always be an impatience in sections of the fan base, thinking we haven't done enough yet, we need to do more. But they've got 2 in the building, 2 that they wanted to go and do early doors. One of them didn't cost anything in terms of a fee. The other has cost less than I think people were fearing or expecting. So there's quite a few ticks in boxes already, but they need more soon, Joe. They need to keep going quickly, work fast.
They've got to build on it. Yeah, they got to keep building on it. And I mean, there's every indication that they will. We know that they're still after another striker. But just going back onto the point of impatience and certain sections of the fan base maybe being a bit apprehensive about we need to have a look at how many other Premier League clubs have signed 2 players already. Certainly 2 players who, in an ideal world, if Nemec is fit, he will play a decent amount. And Biol, of course, being signed as a starter, we assume. How many other teams have managed to do that? The ones that are at the Club World Cup aside. And as well, obviously the medical was done on the Wednesday. We were getting, positive noises throughout the week that yes, while it's taking its time, there's no indication of failed medicals or anything that you need to worry about. And that's why it was, from our perspective, quite a relaxed weekend. I know that wasn't everybody's disposition, shall we say. But, there were, there's only so many times you can say it. Everything's gone fine. Everything is fine. We're just waiting on, regulatory stuff, contractual stuff. Just, yeah, these things, it's difficult when you move a player overseas or from overseas. So, yeah, I think it's a good bit of business. And also, it's great because it allowed me to bring back Tweet of the Week. It's technically not even a tweet. It was a post on Blue Sky from an individual called Graham, spelt differently, some would say correctly, to yours. And it was along the lines of, in fact, I know where I can find it, so bear with me just a second. And I thought, I saw it and I thought, great, that is going to be immediately our episode title for this week. So I have to thank Graham. Our new defensive rock, our Granite Jaka. Sorry, what? You're telling me that's someone's actual name and he's also an elite footballer? You know what? Fair play, Graham. That's good stuff. And he also did have a joke to make as well about Biol's jawline. Replying to someone who was talking about the length of the medical, he said, couldn't find a tape long enough to measure his jawline, which I thought, again, was we're on the same page there, me and Graham. Maybe it's something to do with the name. But yeah, Granite Jaka, I thought that's perfect for this week. And yeah, he does look like he's made out of the finest Slovenian granite, doesn't he?
Yeah, I'd like to see his DEXA bone scan that they'll do, either as part of the medical or part of his testing, pre-season testing, just to see if there is kind of traces of steel in there, or maybe denser bones. If you were to raise a concern about Jaka Biol in the Premier League, what would it be, and why would it be pace?
It would be pace, and it would be recovery pace, so that if you get him facing his own goal, I think that's where, especially in the Premier League, where you've got just a higher intensity of attacking player, they're faster, sprint volume and sprint capacity is higher. I do think if you get him facing his own goal, that's when maybe he could maybe look like he's, maybe a bit too slow. We know that Pascal Struijk has had those issues in the past as well. Ultimately, it's an occupational hazard of being 6'4", isn't it? There's a lot more mass to carry and to turn. So I'm going to turn a negative into a positive, because that's just the way that I am, Graham. If you have him in the team as primarily a box defender, someone who's just going to kick and head everything as far away from the danger zone as possible, I think he is absolutely spot on as a £15 million signing. If you are going to play an expansive brand of football where you sit your defensive line on the halfway line and you ask him to basically cover space in behind and in front, maybe not so much then. But yeah, I don't think that that's the way that Leeds are going to play next season, because I think it's quite well established that they'll probably get cut to ribbons if they decide to play a high line. What's your concern, shall we say, of Biol? And again, it's pace, but do you have anything more specific than recovery speed?
I think I would probably just want to ensure that my fullbacks had enormous engines on them, V8s, because they're going to need them, and we saw Rodon make an awful lot of recovery runs. Rodon did a lot of clearing up for other defenders last season. You'd see him making recovery runs into the right back position because Bogle was upfield playing as an incredibly attacking fullback. We saw him sweeping in behind Pascal quite a few times when the ball went in over Pascal's head and Pascal got caught on the turn. I think he'll probably have to do a bit of that again next season, but I'd like to see him get a bit more help in that regard. So I certainly wouldn't expect Leeds fullbacks to be playing as secondary wingers next season. I mean, on the counter-attack, absolutely, and if they get a chance to overlap, absolutely, but certainly not taking starting positions that are so high up the pitch. Yeah, I think I'm going to become a pragmatist for the next year, and I'm going to set my sights on clean sheets and defending the box. I think that's where I'm going to derive my satisfaction, going against everything within me that just wants to see attacking football and football played in the way it was played circa 2020, 2021. I think it makes a lot of sense for Leeds to be focusing and zeroing in on physicality, being hard to beat, and defending the area, defending set pieces. I think it's all very sensible stuff. And maybe it is just going to be a year or 2 years of suffering a bit more. Managers use the word suffering, don't they? What they mean is defending a bit more in order to establish yourself in the Premier League. And then once you're established, you can start to be a bit more adventurous. But I certainly wouldn't like to see Leeds become a flat back five, sitting in and trying to do what Wigan did to Bielsa and what what a few others did to Farke over the last 2 seasons. I don't think I'd like to see them be wholly stubborn and defensive. I'd like to see a bit of creativity as well. So if there's a way that they can meld the two, I'll be interested.
Is there a way to weld or marry together Beale's prior experience as a centre forward, albeit a few games, but still played there, and Leeds pushing for a late winner? Is that something that we might see at Ellen Road this season?
I'm absolutely keen to explore a Leeds United front line that has an average height of 6'2", and the ball's being swung into the box and they're throwing their heads at everything. It creates chaos, doesn't it? I mean, it's not what you don't want to see is David James type scenes, when he was playing up front. I mean, the word galoot was invented for such a scenario, wasn't it? But it doesn't harm you to have a 6'4" guy in the box when you're swinging in corners and free kicks and crosses, trying to get something out of a game, particularly if you've got quality delivery. It certainly wouldn't harm you at all. Let's see it. All for it.
Who are your most favoured unconventional centre forwards in the past? Are there any who kind of spring to mind? Because I mean, the David James example when Stuart Pearce brought him on for Manchester City, I think 2006 maybe, in sort of the last minute. That's one which really stands out. I mean, there's Pascal Struijk coming on against Sunderland. I mean, I know that wasn't explicitly an unconventional centre forward role, but he was there with his head on it twice in the closing stages. I'd really, really like to see if that was Jaka Biol instead, he'd have been up there dunking on Luke O'Nien, just nut, and he would have got a hat trick instead. That all got a bit soccer AM there, didn't it? Rather than inside Ellen Road. I'm getting carried away. Maybe it's because I think Luke O'Nien's a faux hard man. Yeah, are there any who spring to mind as ones which you think, that's very old school, where you stick the sweeper up top?
Jerry Taggart. I loved seeing Jerry Taggart operating in the penalty area. He had a bit of a bullet header on him at times. Do you know who I thought of when you said unconventional? I thought of Jan Koller. Now, I know that he was a centre forward, Czech Republic, but he looked like a centre half. And at times he played like physically battled like a centre half. Like it must have been for defenders, like playing against themselves at times, because he was such a big brute. I really loved watching him operate. All for Jaka Biol becoming a goal threat. Yeah, let's see that happen. One of the other aspects of the deal that I thought we could talk about, there started to become a little bit of a narrative last week as people started to get a little bit antsy about this deal not being announced, fretting that it was the inexperience of the Leeds United recruitment team that meant they weren't able to get this deal over the line. I always felt that would become part of the narrative this summer at some stage. I was probably a little bit surprised that it came so early, but you can understand why, because people thought this deal was done last Tuesday. Why is he not announced yet? And I thought that we could talk a little bit about the way that transfers are going to work at Leeds this summer in terms of the personnel and where the targets are coming from and who gets a yes and who gets a no. It's not our job to reassure people that everything's going to be fine, but we can talk about how it works at Leeds and how Leeds think it's going to be successful and why they're confident. There's an element of people being worried that last summer was a success because Nick Hammond was involved. And we can't really say yes or no on that, but we can talk about what it looks like now. So you've got Alex Davies, who's head of recruitment, and you've got Adam Underwood, who's sporting director, and they're in charge of pitching to players initially, but then they can bring in the MD, Robbie Evans. They could bring in Parag Marathi towards the end of a deal if they need to, if they're going club to club and trying to hammer something out. I know that the big guns got brought in, didn't they, for the Archie Gray, to get the Archie Gray thing over the line. Probably as beads of sweat started to form on heads as that PSR accounting period deadline loomed closer and closer. So they can bring in kind of the big guns, if you want to call them that, this summer. But way before we get to that, I think it's important to talk about where targets come from. And I've been thinking a lot about this whole idea of the nerds, people like you with laptops, taking over the game, ruining it for football men, real football men, manly men who've played football. There was a little bit of that at Sheffield United, wasn't there, with the whole Wilder's going. They've got this AI-driven data link that they're identifying Nigerian players with. And there's a suspicion, isn't there, that football men, football people are being squeezed out by machines. Now, our sister title at the Sheffield Star was able to knock that down as a suggestion that wasn't the reason why they parted company with Wilder, and wasn't why he wanted to go. But there's also been a little bit leads of people thinking that Farka didn't want signings because they were data signings. And one of those that people were suspicious about was Largi Ramazani. But club sources insist that he was actually a scouting signing. Well, not a scouting signing. He was identified by scouts, first and foremost, because you can identify players through your scouts. You can identify them through the data by looking at your database and saying, we want a tiny winger who runs very, very fast and is direct and can hit the ball very hard from 25 yards and will pop up centrally, that kind of thing. You can put that into a database and it'll bring you a list of players in the leagues that you're looking at, and then you filter through them and then you take a look at them. Or you can have players that are recommended by club staff. So you can have a manager who is very, very keen on Al Tanaka and says, I would like Al Tanaka, please, or Ilya Gruev. And then the scouts take a look and then they check his data. So you bring all of those three together. But Ramazani was identified initially by scouts rather than by someone on a laptop. But I don't know about you. What do you think about the term football people?
I'm really glad that you've asked me that at the very moment that I feel like I'm about to sneeze. I'm not saying that it's an allergic reaction to the term football men or football people. It's passed, actually, thankfully. I think you need both. You need people who've got experience in the game. You also need people who've got a different perspective on things. It's like anything. If you run a business and you've got tunnel vision, then how you are naturally going to run into obstacles and roadblocks. How are you going to navigate them if you don't have expertise in various different areas? You need people with data expertise. You need people with scouting experience. You need people with experience of how to do deals, and just basically leaning on people because they've been executives at a high level in football for a number of years. They've got the relationships. They know how to work certain people. They know how to work certain clubs. You need experience from everywhere. It's why if you went with a 100% data-driven approach and you championed that and said, look, we are going to recruit exclusively using data, I think you'd come unstuck pretty quickly. You also need to have it needs to be is confluence the right word?
I like it, yeah.
Of idea, because I have used the wrong word on this podcast a few times. Peak amplitude, and you need a melting pot of ideas to come from various different sources, and then to convene with all those people in a room or in a virtual call or whatever, and then basically see what comes out the other side. If you're kind of putting it through like a virtual transfer foie gras machine, and then it'll ping at the end. I know that's not what they do, but it'll ping and then it'll say, or it'll go, and that's not the player for Leeds United. So you want more pings and green lights than not, but ultimately there will be some targets that don't pass the eye test. There'll be some targets who don't pass the data test, and it's about weighing up, whether they are going to be worthwhile or not. Because you're recruiting for Leeds United, you're not recruiting for Manchester City, Real Madrid. There are going to be players with faults and flaws, so you've got to weigh them up, and ultimately that requires a confluence. I'm going to sound like a dick if confluence is the wrong word.
Just going to clip up you saying I'm going to sound like a right dick. and then use it
as
all the
if you
time.
A, know how to clip up, and B, I'd ever let you do that.
The way it works at Leeds is that everybody has to be on board with the signing. So it has to. You've got the data. It has to make sense. It has to make sense for Daniel Farke. He has to like the player, and he has to be able to see the player in his plans. The scouts, the scouting team, the recruitment team have to like the player, and the club have to like the numbers. They have to be able to say, yes, we can do that. And from what we're told, Farke can say no at any point. We're also told that at no point last summer did he say no to a signing, and they went ahead and brought one in anyway. But there's a yes and there's a yes, isn't there? There's a yes when you're asked if you want Ao Tanaka, and maybe with one or two others, there's a yeah, and they took that as a big yes. And I think that would be natural, wouldn't it? That a manager would be utterly convinced in some signings and would perhaps harbour the odd reservation with others because they were slightly less proven quantities, slightly less experienced perhaps, and he wasn't quite sure yet that he could trust them in the way that he knew he could trust other players. And those players simply have to gain his trust through what they do in training or the little chances they get. But it'll always kind of stick in my mind that he used the phrase young and interesting last summer. That felt carefully chosen.
It felt like said player was about to get 57 league minutes.
Yeah. But it also, there was an element of expectation management, wasn't there, from Farke? And, don't expect these players to be world beaters just yet because they're wildly inexperienced at this level. So it will be interesting to see and to hear from Daniel Farke as we move into pre-season when it comes to recruitment and the club's plans. And I can't wait for our first, yes, I only talk about business when it's done, but also I can't wait to hear the other little bits that let us know what he's thinking and feeling, how he's feeling about the pace of the recruitment versus the, upcoming fixtures.
He's very good at that, isn't he, Farke? Sort of telling us in so many words how he's really feeling without being explicit with it, which I think is a sign of good managing up and good managing down. Do you want to know the dictionary definition of confluence?
Yes.
This is beautiful. The junction of two rivers, especially rivers of approximately equal width. Now, if that is not the perfect word to describe how the recruitment process works at Leeds, then I don't know what is.
It's perfect.
I'm going to pat myself on the back after this. That. Sometimes you're just really on form, and today clearly that is just one of those days. Yeah. Shall we talk about players that they're not signing and also players that they're not selling yet?
Yeah, we can do.
Yeah. So, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, there have been a lot of stories, lots and lots of noise from Italy linking Leeds with not just interest, but a bid and agreements for Lecce striker Nikola Krstovic, who scored 11 goals and got a further 5 assists for Lecce last season. And so that brings him to 16 goal contributions. They only scored 27. So I think it's fair to say he was quite influential for them. There had been reports from various sources in Italy suggesting that a 25 to 26 million euro agreement had been reached between Leeds and Lecce. But ultimately, the sticking point was nobody knows whether he actually wants to join Leeds or not. Now, we, from our side, the YEP side, we check these things out as you do, double source and make sure that, that we're not being, sold a dream or we're being lied to, or we're kind of being used as a convenient megaphone for, I don't know, agents or players that might want to move to move somewhere. And, the information that we came across was that, it's false that Leeds had an agreement. he's not a player that Leeds were interested in. Certainly not at this stage of the window. While yes, they are interested in adding a striker, certainly one who can start and is probably going to play more frequently than Nemecha. Kustovic wasn't that man. Graham, you had that same information as well. We had a confluence of our own, didn't we? To sort of a sharing of ideas, and believe me, because of the strength of reporting in Italy, we had a real back and forth about it. But ultimately, we've come to the conclusion at this stage of the window that what we're being told is that Kustovic is not a player that Leeds are signing at the moment.
Yeah, we've spoken to a couple of people and double checked with them and triple checked with them, because someone is really pushing this one very, very, very hard. Somebody is very invested in the idea that Leeds United really want this player. And that's okay. They can be, but our information just says differently. And sometimes it will. Sometimes I think you can consider a lot of things when it comes to a transfer and a link to Leeds United. You have to consider that when a player is linked to Leeds United, it alerts other clubs that might be interested in that player that you might face competition for this. And if you think that Leeds United might have an agreement in place for this player, then it might just hurry you up a little bit. If you think, well, actually, he's one of our targets, we need to get in there now and do that. There's also a very handy caveat to this reporting as well, that the player is not convinced, which of course is a fallback, I suppose, if nothing happens with this player. But we're certainly not expecting anything with this player. There's nothing imminent at Leeds United, as far as we know, for the next couple of days, transfer-wise anyway. But we're certainly not expecting anything with this player. But we do know that they want a 9. And they were very, very quick, Leeds, to clarify when it came to Nemecha that they were still in the market for a 9. I think, again, managing expectations and just stopping at source those worries that this was the player that Leeds have earmarked as their starting 9 in the Premier League, because that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, as we've said on this podcast several times, Leeds United's name is a very convenient one to bring up in reports, because it's a club which has a massive fan base. All you guys, you jump on the transfer news, any sort of link, and it's okay. Is this real? And that's absolutely fine. It's reflective of a team that has a huge following. As Graham says, if, for example, you want to tell trusted Italian journalistic sources that your player, or the player that you might think is at the peak value that you can sell them for, has an agreement with a team that are not interested in him, the teams that he is likely to be sold to, who might be hesitating a little bit, or like dragging their feet, or might not be able to go to the price that has been quoted as having as Leeds having agreed, then yeah, it sharpens the decision making. It forces them into action. It speeds things along, and particularly if you need. I mean, look at the date. It's the 25th of June. Particularly if you need a sale, or you need to prove to your client that you can get him a sale before a certain date, before agreements expire, and before accounting deadlines are hit. So
I think I'd probably just add that the rule of thumb with Leeds United and club sources tends to be that if you go to them with something that is true, they hold their hands up and confirm that is true, and they might add context that they feel they'd like to be out there, that you will then weigh up as to whether or not you want to report that. For instance, we're still looking for another 9 after Nemecha, or when we went to them with Siddiqui, whenever that was, I don't know, it feels like a while ago now. They were like, yes, he's a player we're interested in, but we haven't made an offer yet. And that, you stood that up at the other end as well in Belgium. They do try and operate in silence, the 49ers. That is their entire mantra. I mean, Parag Marathi was talking about it after the Rangers EGM this week, that they'll speak when there's something to say. And if you don't hear from them, it means that things are going well. But they don't keep such a tight leash on stuff that if you go to them with something that is true, like when I got a message to say Lucas Nemec is in the country and is going to sign for Leeds. Double check with club sources, and they said straight away, yes, your sources are right. We are doing that one, and it's very close, and it'll happen very soon. It would seem strange to me that they would be so reticent to admit an interest in a player that the reporting is so specific on in Italy. Why, in this case, would Leeds be so keen to deny any interest? And then when you speak to other people as well, who would have knowledge of the situation, they say, no, this is not one for Leeds. And someone else raised with me the point that at that price, it would not be a good deal for Leeds, the price that's being talked about. And equally, another person put forward the view that this player would crawl to Leeds if Leeds United were really interested in bringing him to the Premier League. No, I can't speak to that, but there is just one little cautionary tale that I thought I'd tell. I'll keep it vague because I want to be respectful, and I'm always very respectful, Joe, of everyone apart from you.
And I think one of these individuals is now in a very high-powered position. I think it's fair to say.
No, there's a different cautionary tale. Then maybe you've got one as well. The one I was going to tell was simply the story of someone coming to us and saying that a number of clubs were interested in this player, player who was at Leeds United, young player, and the names of a couple of the clubs raised our eyebrows straight away, thinking, bloody hell, really? He's doing well for himself. That was kind of a little bit of a check mark for us because we wanted to look into that a bit more closely and started to. I'm aware that another media organisation's response was to the same information. Everyone was sent the same information. Their response was, well, we'll check that at the other end. And there was a bit of an, don't do that. But it did emerge. This link was made publicly, and perhaps unquestioningly by someone else. As it turned out, I don't even think that one of the clubs that was mentioned was particularly keen on this player, and he hasn't ended up at any of those clubs. You absolutely have to question everything you're told, and we absolutely do. And we'll do our level best to dig into stuff and double source stuff to try and get to the bottom of things. But I would like to think that the YEP will not, at any stage this window or in any other windows, tell you that someone is signing for Leeds when they are not. That seems like a very low bar, but it is something. It is something at least. I am intrigued as to your cautionary tale, though. Can you tell it in an equally vague way that keeps us out of legal bother?
Yeah, I can try and keep us out of legal bother. So again, it was to do with a player who was at Leeds, and we'd both had information from varying different sources that something that we put to those people was false. It only turned out after the fact that it turns out that information was true, but we'd had it from two reasonably trustworthy places that it was false, but they had very different reasons for why they told us it was false when it was in fact true, which I think is very rare. Usually you'd get one side of that who would tell you it's false because they have a real vested interest in it, and then from another side you would get, no, actually, yeah, that is true, because there's not really anything to be gained. In that case, that very rare case, there was, both sides sort of saying, no, that's false. And again, that's not one where I think they conferred those two sources of information. I don't think they conferred, the sources with knowledge, to be like, okay, let's mislead the YEP. I think that was just a case of, those two independently, their vested interest was to keep that little nugget of information, well, rather quite large piece of information, under wraps.
And I think that's obviously a learning point that has been taken forward, because then you you weigh that against any time you have to use that source again. But the other point I'd make is that I tell people to look at the disparity in the reporting of the figures for some of the deals that happen. There was a very, very big deal that Liverpool did, and there was reporting of a fee, and there was a big disparity, a big disparity in some of the reporting around that suggests to all of us, and I don't think you need any insider information to deduce this, that sometimes the information will be false. And that is why you absolutely have to do your best to double check what you're being told, even if it's from a source that you've previously used and thought, yeah, very, very trustworthy, which is what we've done on all of the things that we've written about this summer, because you want to be right. Everyone wants to be first, obviously, but the most important thing is being right. And I don't think we've been inaccurate. We've certainly not been knowingly inaccurate this summer, but I can't think of an instance where we've certainly not said that someone's signing and they aren't. We certainly haven't said that Leeds are not interested when they have been, and that is generally how the summer will continue to go, I think. Leeds trying desperately to keep hold of the information, but holding their hands up whenever stuff is actually real and happening. And there's a lot of business to do, both ins and outs. And one of those you would expect would be Ilhan Meslier.
Yeah, there was obviously the reports from Turkey, which you always take with a pinch of salt, because again, there's an enormous appetite for football there, and where there is an enormous appetite for football, there are an enormous volume of publications. And not being an expert on that part of the world, I don't know, their equivalent of the Times. I don't know their equivalent of a lesser publication.
Steady.
Yeah.
Steady.
A lesser publication, shall we say, or the locals who would be in with clubs and whatnot. But yeah, there was the reports from Turkey that Ilhan Meslier was a target for was it Fenerbahce?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, take it away, Graham. What's the scuttlebutt with that one?
It's absolutely plausible that Ilhan Meslier would be a target for Fenerbahce. They are looking for a goalkeeper. They're about to part with their Croatian international stopper. Very plausible that, I mean, if I was Ilhan Meslier and a club who will be in the Champions League qualifiers and compete at the top end of their division, routinely play European football, if they were in for me at a time in my career when I need to reinvent, when I know that I'm not going to be a first choice starter at Leeds in all probability next season, then I would be keen on that as well. But while there was kind of an imminence to the tone of some of the reporting suggesting it was all on and about to happen, Leeds have yet to receive any offers for him. And again, what I'll say to that is that selling clubs are often a lot more free and easy with information than buying clubs. And the reason for that is when you're selling a player, it doesn't harm you to have other clubs know that he's available, and even potentially what the price point might be, because then you might encourage another club to think, well, if that player is now available, let's go and have a look. Let's maybe go and get involved. I don't know that a bidding war breaks out in very many cases because stuff has been leaked, but clubs certainly hang tight and hang tighter to information relating to incoming business a lot more. They're a lot more paranoid when it comes to incoming business than they are when it comes to outgoing. But as it stands, Leeds haven't had an offer for Ilhan. That could change very, very quickly. It's very possible that Fenerbahce have sounded out Meslier. Melier's people have said, yes, let's do this. We think from our discussions with Leeds that he's probably available for this amount. And then, suddenly a facsimile arrives, or an email or a phone call. And then, then it'll be on. So things can change very, very quickly. But as we understand it, nothing absolutely imminent.
Just looking up and down their squad, it's kind of a who's who of how did you get there of ex-Premier League players. You've got Cenk Tosun, who was formerly at Everton. He's there. Edin Dzeko, 39 years old and captain in Fenerbahce. Dusan Tadic, 36, formerly of Southampton, of course. Cengiz Ünder, I believe he had a time at Leicester. Alan St. Maximin, he had a decent spell at a northeastern club. Who else? We got Fred, who was over the Pennines. Sofian Amrabat. I feel like he definitely played Premier League football at some point.
Yeah.
One of those
Bright
rogue.
Osei Samuel.
Sorry.
Bright Osei Samuel, former heavily Leeds linked player.
Yeah.
He's there.
Wonder where they came from. Those links. Who else do they have? Chala Soyuncu, the former Leicester defender as well. Diego Carlos, formerly of Aston Villa. Yeah, quite a lot. Who's who? It's often you find that with teams in the Turkish Super League. No, that's good stuff on Melian. I think all very plausible, as you say. I think it's very insightful to sort of hear how the transfer gauntlet, as you put it in your Inside Ellen Road newsletter this week, kind of works, especially at this time of year. I mean, yes, Graham and I have basically just taken the stance that even in our personal lives, just assume that everyone's lying to you at all times. You know, yeah, I was a very trusting individual before I got this job, but it wears you down. But no, you do have to question everything. It's not as simple as there is a link and it must be true, because as we know, Leeds don't begin the season with 76 players on their books, all of whom have been linked for varying different fees. So yeah, you got to take a lot of it with not just a pinch of salt, but an entire salt grinder worth. And yeah, just keep your heads about you while everyone else is losing theirs.
A very wise man, formerly of this parish, once described Italy as the Wild West when it came to transfers, the business of, not just the reporting of. Habib Diarra, Joe, at what point do you give up and you move on to Siddiqui? At what point do you say, you know what, we're not going to be able to get this one done? And is he so much better than a Siddiqui, for example, that it's worth holding out for and it's worth pushing the price up a little bit more?
I think they're slightly different players. I mean, not, on the price point, what you're saying there is, yeah, while people will go, oh, well, they've opened with 22, they've gone to 23, supposedly, but Strasbourg want 25. Why are we messing around? I mean, it's a couple million quid. Like it all makes a difference and it all adds up. So if you can get a cheaper deal, then you will try and get a cheaper deal. Yeah, I mean, Siddiqui and Diarra are slightly different players. I mean, Diarra's probably around 5'11", 6 foot more like. Siddiqui's more around the 5'7", 8 mark. So I'm not sure you could compare them directly. They both have that midfield dynamism, the box-to-box element, but I'd say that Siddiqui's more of a defensive-minded player. He's got experience playing it in the fullback positions. At what point do you give up? I mean, Siddiqui's definitely not going to cost 25 million. I can say that for certain. Also, if Leeds have, as we know, put that bid in for 22 million, the initial one for Diarra, it tells all of their other potential midfield targets, we've got 22 million to spend on this profile of player. So I don't know whether you then go for a player quite publicly who you know is probably not going to cost that much. What point do you give up? Honestly, don't know, Graham. I feel as though if they were confident of the possibility of it, then they would have said that at the beginning. Club sources would have indicated in the same way that they did about Jaka that, yeah, it's one that they think they can get done. At the time we approached them with the names and said, look, Habib Diarra, Jaka anything in these, Leeds hadn't agreed a fee for Biol at that point. There was still some negotiating to do. It feels like things haven't progressed with Diarra, or at least not progressed in the way that you'd hope them to, if he was going to be imminent.
I guess it all comes down to their confidence in a player being a difference maker, in being that slight level above the other alternates in their lists. But I just keep thinking in my mind, 7th of July, pre-season, back for training, then away to Stockholm in Germany. We are now coming to the end of June, then we're into July, and then the football is upon us very, very quickly. And you want as many of those new faces to play as many minutes in pre-season as humanly possible, and have as many training sessions at Thorpe Arch as humanly possible. Now, that's not to say that you just abandon priority targets, because there's a bit of resistance, and simply go and get other players that you can get. We know that Leeds were very, very reluctant to do that last summer, and that they felt that waiting would give them a better caliber of player. But I think that they will be more balanced in their outlook this summer between urgency and patience. I think last summer it was, if there was like a little dial and one side of it was urgency and one side of it was patience, they had dialed it all the way to patience last summer. I think this summer it'll be slightly more in the middle.
Right, well, that's just about everything on this week's episode of the Inside Elland Road podcast. As I alluded to with Graham's Inside Elland Road newsletter, there's more of a written version of that spiel about how the transfer gauntlet works. And again, like many of you did in the weeks prior, if you've got a taste for it and you'd quite like to read more about that and just see how things work, but you're not already signed up, then do get in touch with Graham, and he'll be able to provide the goods, as long as you're able to provide proof of payment. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. We'll chat to you next week. Bye for now.